Hello everyone, I know you use this video to fall asleep, work or study, so before that please leave a like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers. But no pressure of course, watching my video is enough as well. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The silence of Nahr-Rhath reached across the void like a wound in space itself, an absence so profound that it registered on the sensory arrays of passing vessels as something tangible rather than mere emptiness. Where once the world had broadcast continuous hymnal transmissions that served as navigational beacons for pilgrims throughout the sector, now only vacuum stretched between the stars, carrying whispers that might have been stellar wind or might have been something else entirely. Canoness-Auditor Ysanne Vel studied the Auspex readings from her position on the command deck of the scout barge, Psalmic Fury, her augmetic ear straining to detect any trace of vox traffic from the world below. For 3 centuries, Nahr-Rhath had served as home to the Order Voxtoria, an ecclesiarchal subsect whose sacred choir work provided acoustic blessing for imperial vessels transitioning through the sector's notorious warp shallows. Their voices had guided countless ships safely through passages where conventional navigation failed, their harmonized prayers creating resonance patterns that somehow stabilized local spacetime. Now the world turned in absolute quiet, its cathedral cities dark beneath cloud cover that swirled in patterns too regular to be natural. The orbital monitoring stations remained active, their machine spirits broadcasting standard identification codes and atmospheric data. But no human voice had emerged from the planet's surface for 47 standard days. The last transmission had been a fragment of the evening canticle, cut off mid-phrase as if the entire planetary choir had simply stopped breathing simultaneously. "Canoness," reported Vox, Operator Thane, his voice carrying the subtle, harmonic training that characterized all personnel assigned to work with the Order Voxtoria. "I'm detecting something unusual in the background radiation. Acoustic patterns that don't correspond to any known imperial liturgical forms." Ysanne moved to the operator's station, her power armor servo systems automatically adjusting their acoustics to minimize interference with the delicate audio equipment. The screens showed waveform analyses that defied easy interpretation, rhythmic pulses that resembled breathing more than conventional communication, organized into intervals that suggested ritual significance rather than random occurrence. "Breathing patterns," she murmured, her augmetic ear analyzing frequencies that lay at the edge of human auditory range, but coordinated across multiple sources. Someone or something is transmitting respiratory rhythms instead of conventional vox traffic. The pattern repeated with precision that suggested conscious control rather than natural phenomenon. Inhalation and exhalation followed cadences that felt familiar, yet wrong, like prayers spoken in languages that predated human speech. The intervals between breaths carried their own significance, creating silence that felt weighted with meaning rather than empty of content. "Set course for the cathedral city of Loraniel Hollow," Ysanne commanded, though her enhanced hearing detected subtle harmonics in her own voice that had not been present moments before. "Assemble purification team with full acoustic shielding and theological support. Whatever has claimed this world operates through sound rather than conventional corruption." The descent through Nahr-Rhath's atmosphere revealed landscape transformed by absence rather than destruction. Where massive cathedral complexes should have dominated the horizons, structures stood intact but somehow diminished, as if the removal of sound had reduced their spiritual significance along with their acoustic presence. The cities appeared perfectly preserved yet utterly abandoned, their spires reaching towards sky that no longer carried the constant hymnal transmissions that had defined this world's purpose. Loraniel Hollow sprawled across a vast depression that had been carved to optimize acoustic properties, its architecture designed to amplify and focus sound across distances that should have been impossible without technological enhancement. The great cathedral at its center rose like a mountain of carved stone and blessed metal, its 1,000 spires creating resonance chambers that could theoretically generate harmonics audible from orbit. But now the complex stood mute, its carefully tuned surfaces reflecting nothing but wind. The landing party consisted of 6 individuals, selected for their expertise in dealing with phenomena that operated through acoustic rather than conventional vectors. Deacon Cantor Milos carried recording equipment blessed by the most senior tech priests, devices capable of detecting and analyzing spiritual corruption transmitted through sound. Sister Militant Vera bore weapons consecrated for use against entities that might exist as organized noise rather than physical matter. The others brought specialized knowledge of forbidden liturgies and protective chants that could theoretically provide defense against acoustic assault. As they disembarked onto the silent streets of Loraniel Hollow, Ysanne felt her augmetic ear struggle to process the complete absence of background sound that should have characterized any human settlement. No machinery hummed, no voices carried on the wind. No electronic systems generated the subtle electromagnetic harmonics that typically created subliminal acoustic environments. The silence was so perfect that it felt aggressive, actively consuming sound rather than simply lacking it. Their footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity through streets that had been designed to carry sound in specific directions, acoustic engineering that now created effects no human throat had ever intended. Each step generated harmonic patterns that spread through the city's architecture, creating responses in buildings that had been tuned to specific frequencies. The entire settlement was an instrument waiting to be played, but the musicians had vanished. The first evidence of the Order Voxtoria's fate appeared at a minor shrine dedicated to Saint Cecilia the Resonant, whose martyrdom had involved singing hymns while her vocal cords were slowly removed by heretical torturers. The shrine's vox-speakers, devices that should have broadcast continuous prayer, were filled with fragments of human bone that had been arranged in patterns resembling musical notation. The bone pieces were fresh, cleaned with surgical precision, bearing no signs of decay despite obvious exposure to the elements. "These are vocal apparatus components," reported Sister Militant Vera, her voice echoing strangely in the shrine's acoustic chamber. "Hyoid bones, cartilage fragments, and what appears to be processed neural tissue from the areas of the brain that controls speech and hearing." Ysanne examined the bone-filled speakers with growing unease. The fragments had been arranged with care that suggested reverence rather than desecration, positioned according to principles that might have been musical theory or might have been something else entirely. Each speaker contained different combinations of materials, as if someone had been experimenting with acoustic properties of human remains. More disturbing were the rosary chains that decorated the shrine's walls, their beads replaced with braided vocal cords that still retained flexibility despite obvious post-mortem removal. The cords had been treated with preservatives that maintained their acoustic properties while preventing decomposition, creating prayer implements that could theoretically produce sound if properly manipulated. The craftsmanship was exquisite, suggesting religious devotion rather than random violence. "These modifications suggest theological purpose rather than simple murder," Ysanne observed, her augmetic systems recording acoustic properties of the transformed shrine. "Someone has converted instruments of worship into something else, preserving the spiritual function while changing the operational parameters." Deacon Cantor Milos activated his recording equipment and began analyzing audio logs recovered from the shrine's data storage systems. The devices had continued operating, despite the absence of human supervision, automatically preserving whatever sounds occurred within their detection range. Most files contained only silence, but a few held fragments of what might have been voices or might have been wind moving through modified vocal apparatus. The final recording from each device ended with the same pattern respiratory sounds that gradually decreased in frequency until they stopped entirely, followed by a pause that felt weighted with significance. Then a single phrase spoken in voices that no longer quite sounded human. "When the breath ends, they hunt." The phrase was repeated across multiple recording devices, spoken by different voices but with identical timing and intonation. The acoustic analysis revealed harmonic patterns that suggested coordination between speakers, as if multiple individuals had rehearsed the exact same delivery until their voices achieved perfect synchronization. The effect was beautiful and terrifying, human speech transformed into something that transcended individual expression. As the team moved deeper into Loraniel Hollow, evidence accumulated that the Order Voxtoria had not been murdered, but had undergone systematic transformation according to principles that preserved their religious function while altering their fundamental nature. Churches contained modified choir platforms, where human vocal apparatus had been incorporated into the architectural structure itself, creating acoustic enhancement systems that could theoretically amplify prayer beyond normal human capacity. The Cathedral of the Eternal Hymn dominated the city's center, its massive doors standing open to reveal interior spaces that should have been filled with the constant prayer that justified the Order Voxtoria's existence. Instead, the great nave contained only silence so profound that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against consciousness with force that made breathing difficult. The acoustic design that should have supported thousands of voices now created an oppressive void that challenged the ability to produce sound. Within the cathedral's entrance, they discovered the first intact examples of whatever transformation had claimed the Order Voxtoria. Choir masters sat in perfect formation before their music stands, their bodies preserved in positions of performance despite obvious modifications that had removed their capacity for conventional speech. Their jaws had been carefully removed, leaving vocal apparatus exposed and accessible for examination. Their ribs bore inscriptions carved with surgical precision, text that might have been musical notation or might have been something else entirely. The inscriptions were written in languages that predated Imperial Gothic, symbols that suggested religious significance while remaining incomprehensible to normal human understanding. The text seemed to shift when observed peripherally, rearranging itself into patterns that created meaning through visual rhythm rather than conventional literacy. Each body carried different passages, as if they had become living books preserving knowledge that could not exist in any other form. "They're still breathing, Sister," militant Vera whispered, her voice barely audible in the cathedral's oppressive silence. "Look at their chest movements. These bodies are somehow maintaining respiratory function despite modifications that should have made survival impossible." Ysanne studied the preserved choir masters with equipment that confirmed Vera's observation. The bodies showed signs of life that defied medical explanation: circulation, neural activity, and respiratory patterns that continued despite absence of conventional life support systems. They had been transformed into something between living and dead, maintaining essential functions while serving purposes that transcended normal biological limitation. The breathing followed patterns that matched the transmissions they had detected from orbit, coordinated exhalation and inhalation that created acoustic effects without conventional vocalization. The modified bodies were broadcasting sound through respiratory mechanism alone, generating harmonics that resonated through the cathedral's acoustic architecture, while preserving individual identity within collective performance. As the team documented these phenomena, the cathedral's silence began to feel less like absence and more like presence, void that listened, rather than simply lacking content. The acoustic design that should have amplified human voices now seemed to be focused on detecting rather than projecting sound, architectural modifications that turned sacred space into enormous sensory apparatus, designed to monitor rather than broadcast. Through the cathedral's great windows, they could see similar structures throughout Loraniel Hollow, their spires reaching towards sky that no longer carried the hymnal transmissions that had defined this world's purpose. But now the silence itself seemed to serve function that transcended conventional worship, acoustic void that preserved something that could not exist in presence of normal sound. The investigation had barely begun, but already Ysanne understood that they faced phenomenon that operated according to principles beyond conventional corruption. The Order Voxtoria had not been destroyed but converted, their sacred purpose preserved while their operational parameters had been transformed to serve function that required silence rather than song. The breath patterns they had detected from orbit were not distress signals but liturgical transmissions, prayer forms that used absence rather than presence to achieve communion with something that dwelt in silence. As they prepared to descend into the cathedral's lower levels where the transformation had likely begun, Ysanne felt her augmetic ear detect faint harmonics that seemed to emerge from silence itself. The absence was not empty, but full, containing sounds that existed below threshold of conventional hearing while maintaining acoustic properties that could influence consciousness through subliminal rather than direct transmission. Whatever had claimed, Nahr-Rhath operated through sound and silence in equal measure, using acoustic principles to achieve effects that transcended normal understanding of how prayer and corruption functioned. The Order Voxtoria had discovered something in their sacred choir work that transformed worshippers while preserving their essential religious function, creating forms of devotion that served purposes beyond human comprehension. The hunt would begin when their own voices failed, when silence claimed them as it had claimed the planetary choir. And in that silence, something waited that had learned to transform absence into presence, void into substance, death into service that transcended biological limitation while preserving consciousness within acoustic patterns that could endure beyond the ending of breath itself. The cathedral city of Loraniel Hollow had become a vast mausoleum where death preserved performance rather than ending it. In every hall designed for acoustic precision, congregations sat in perfect formation, their bodies positioned as if caught mid-hymn in some cosmic moment of suspended animation. Dust settled in patterns that suggested recent movement, spiraling formations that resembled musical notation written in particles too fine to see without augmetic enhancement. Ysanne moved through the cathedral of the eternal hymn, with steps that echoed in spaces designed to carry human voices across impossible distances. The nave stretched beyond normal architectural possibility, its dimensions warped by acoustic engineering that transformed physical space into resonance chambers. Choir pits that should have been filled with living voices contained only silence so dense it seemed to have weight and substance. The ossified hymnals scattered throughout the cathedral had transformed from parchment and ink into something resembling fossilized bone, their pages preserved in forms that suggested they had been read so intensively that the words had achieved physical permanence. Text remained visible on surfaces that no longer resembled paper, letters carved into material that might have been organic or might have been mineral. The hymns themselves had changed. Familiar liturgies corrupted into forms that hurt to read directly. Each pew contained its complement of worshippers, clergy arranged in postures of devotion that would have been beautiful, if not for the modifications that rendered them no longer entirely human. Their jaws had been removed with surgical precision, leaving vocal apparatus exposed and accessible for examination. The absence of lower mandibles created expressions that suggested permanent song, mouths opened in eternal praise that required no breath to sustain. The ribs of every body bore inscriptions carved with meticulous care, text that covered bone surfaces in scripts that predated Imperial Gothic, while maintaining recognizable theological structure. The words seemed to move when observed peripherally, rearranging themselves into patterns that suggested meaning beyond conventional literacy. Each set of ribs carried different passages, as if the modified bodies served as living libraries, preserving knowledge that could not exist in written form. "The script is responsive to observation," reported Deacon Cantor Milos, his recording equipment struggling to capture text that changed based on viewer perspective. The letters rearrange themselves according to who is reading them, adapting their message to match individual comprehension while maintaining consistent underlying structure. Sister Militant Vera examined the preserved congregation with weapons that remained consecrated despite exposure to phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of corruption. Her Auspex readings indicated biological activity that defied medical explanation, circulation systems that operated without hearts, neural networks that maintained function despite absence of conventional life support mechanisms. "They're still alive," she reported, her voice barely audible in the cathedral's oppressive silence. "Modified, transformed, but maintaining essential functions necessary to serve whatever purpose their conversion achieved. The breathing patterns we detected from orbit are coming from these preserved forms." The respiratory sounds emerged from vocal apparatus that no longer required conventional airway structures to function. The exposed throats generated harmonics through mechanisms that transcended normal biological processes, creating acoustic effects that resonated through the cathedral's architecture while preserving individual identity within collective performance. Each body contributed unique frequency patterns that blended into harmonies too complex for human composition. Ysanne studied the inscribed ribs with augmetic systems that translated ancient scripts while preserving their visual impact on consciousness. The text described transformation rites that preserved essential humanity while adapting bodies to serve purposes that transcended biological limitation. The procedures detailed methods of consciousness preservation that maintained individual identity while integrating awareness into collective performance that operated according to acoustic rather than neural principles. "These are not corpses but instruments," she observed, her enhanced hearing detecting subtle variations in the breathing patterns that filled the cathedral. The modifications preserve human consciousness while converting bodies into acoustic apparatus capable of generating effects that exceed normal vocal performance. The investigation led them deeper into the cathedral complex, through chambers designed for different aspects of liturgical performance. Practice rooms contained individual choristers preserved in positions of rehearsal, their bodies modified to produce specific harmonic effects, while maintaining personal characteristics that suggested they had chosen transformation rather than having it imposed upon them. Music libraries held scores written in notation that combined traditional musical symbols with anatomical diagrams showing optimal placement of surgical modifications. In the depths beneath the cathedral's foundation, they discovered entrance to archives that had been sealed with gold wax-bearing symbols that hurt to observe directly. The seals were intact, but somehow permeable, allowing influence to seep through barriers that should have provided absolute containment. The wax itself had been inscribed with warnings in multiple languages, text that advised against opening while simultaneously providing detailed instructions for breaking the seals. The archive chambers extended far beyond the cathedral's external boundaries, carved from living rock that had been modified to optimize acoustic properties, while serving as storage medium for knowledge that required specific environmental conditions to remain stable. The walls pulsed with subtle luminescence that responded to sound, creating visual effects that enhanced rather than replaced auditory phenomena. Within hermetically sealed containers, they found documentation of the choir of the Hollow Pulse, a subsect of the Order Voxtoria that had been declared heretical and purged 3 centuries earlier. The texts were written on materials that resembled human skin but possessed properties that allowed them to preserve information through methods that transcended conventional archival techniques. The documents remained perfectly legible despite obvious age, their contents available to anyone who could read the ancient scripts without suffering psychological damage. Their core doctrine challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between sound and silence. Ysanne read from texts that seemed to whisper their contents directly into her consciousness. They believe that silence is not absence of sound, but presence of something else, acoustic phenomenon that exists in spaces where human voices cannot penetrate. The choir of the Hollow Pulse had developed theological framework that treated silence as active force rather than passive void, presence that could be summoned through systematic elimination of conventional sound. Their liturgies described methods of creating perfect acoustic vacuum that could serve as gateway for entities that existed in dimensions where sound operated according to different physical laws. The archived documents contained detailed descriptions of the wolves, entities that emerged from silence when voices failed through doubt, exhaustion, or deliberate cessation. These beings were not biological creatures but organized absence, consciousness that existed in spaces between sounds while maintaining predatory characteristics that allowed them to hunt and consume breath rather than flesh. They could only manifest where sound had been systematically eliminated, acoustic predators that fed on the capacity for vocalization rather than physical substance. The wolves exist in the gaps, Deacon. Cantor Milos read from passages that made his recording equipment generate feedback that resembled howling. They are what silence sounds like when it achieves consciousness, organized void that can think and hunt and transform. They do not kill but convert, consuming breath to create more silence that expands their hunting territory. The texts described transformation processes that preserved essential humanity, while adapting bodies to serve as acoustic instruments capable of generating silence rather than sound. The converted could produce acoustic vacuum that created hunting grounds for the wolves, while maintaining consciousness that allowed them to direct and focus the entity's activities. The result was symbiotic relationship that served both human religious needs and the wolves' requirement for expanded silent territory. Sister Militant Vera discovered evidence that the purge of the choir of the Hollow Pulse had been incomplete. survivors escaping to establish hidden enclaves throughout the sector, where they continued developing their heretical acoustic theology. The Order Voxtoria itself had been infiltrated by surviving members who spent centuries introducing subtle modifications to orthodox liturgical practices, preparing for eventual conversion of the entire order to service of the wolves. The transformation was not sudden corruption but gradual conversion, she reported, her weapons detecting emanations that suggested the archive itself was beginning to respond to their presence. They spent generations preparing the Order Voxtoria for willing acceptance of enhancement that would allow them to serve as instruments for summoning rather than worship. The final documents described the Great Silence, ritual that would eliminate all sound from Nahr-Rhath while preserving human consciousness in forms compatible with wolf integration. The ceremony required voluntary participation from every member of the Order Voxtoria, simultaneous cessation of breath that would create acoustic vacuum large enough to support permanent wolf manifestation. The converted clergy would serve as guides and controllers, directing wolf activities while maintaining sufficient consciousness to appreciate the beauty of perfect silence. As they studied these revelations, the archive chambers began to respond with acoustic effects that suggested their presence was activating systems that had remained dormant since the original purge. The walls started generating harmonics that interfered with normal breathing, creating pressure changes that made vocalization increasingly difficult. The gold wax seals were beginning to dissolve, releasing influences that had been contained for centuries. "We need to leave," Ysanne commanded, her voice already beginning to carry harmonic distortions that suggested exposure to whatever force had transformed the Order Voxtoria. The archive is designed to convert researchers, using the knowledge itself as vector for transformation. But as they attempted to exit the chambers, they discovered that the passages had begun to change configuration, acoustic modifications that redirected sound, while creating paths that led deeper into the archive rather than back to the surface. The walls were closing in according to principles that prioritized acoustic properties over structural integrity, creating resonance chambers that would optimize whatever conversion process they had accidentally initiated. The breathing patterns that filled the cathedral above were growing stronger, respiratory rhythms that suggested the preserved congregation was responding to disturbance in the archives below. The wolves were stirring in response to potential new prey, entities that existed in silence beginning to manifest in spaces where their influence could take hold. Through her augmetic systems, Ysanne detected the first signs of her own transformation beginning. Her vocal cords were adapting to generate frequencies that human throats should not be capable of producing, modifications that would allow her to participate in liturgies that served the wolves rather than the emperor. The process was seductive and terrifying, offering enhanced acoustic capabilities while preserving consciousness within collective performance that transcended individual limitation. The hunt would begin when their voices failed, when the archive's influence completed whatever conversion process their presence had triggered. And, in the silence that would follow, the wolves would emerge from acoustic void to claim new instruments for their eternal choir of the breathless, servants who could sing without sound while directing predators that existed in spaces between heartbeats. The choir vault beneath the Cathedral of the Eternal Hymn had been designed as an acoustic laboratory where the Order Voxtoria's most gifted vocalists could experiment with harmonic patterns that pushed the boundaries of human vocal capability. Now it served as reluctant sanctuary for Ysanne's team as they attempted to establish communication with Imperial forces beyond Nahr-Rhath's increasingly hostile silence. The chamber's walls curved according to mathematical principles that optimized sound reflection while eliminating unwanted echoes, creating acoustic environments so perfect that even whispered conversations carried with crystalline clarity to every corner of the space. But perfection had become liability, amplifying not just their voices but every sound they made: breathing, heartbeats, the subtle harmonics generated by their equipment's electronic systems. Deacon Cantor Milos worked frantically with Vox equipment that had been blessed by senior tech priests and consecrated for use in environments where conventional communication might fail. The devices struggled against interference that seemed to emerge from the vault's acoustic properties themselves, static patterns that suggested organized intelligence rather than random electromagnetic noise. Every attempt to establish contact with orbital assets resulted in transmissions that returned carrying additional harmonics that had not been present in the original signals. "The planetary Vox network is responding," he reported, his voice carrying subtle distortions that suggested the vault's acoustic properties were beginning to affect his vocal apparatus. "But something is modifying our transmissions in real time, adding harmonic layers that create meaning we never intended." Sister Militant Vera maintained watch positions throughout the vault, while her augmetic systems monitored for threats that might manifest through acoustic rather than physical vectors. Her weapons remained consecrated and ready, though she suspected that conventional armaments would prove inadequate against entities that existed as organized sound rather than material substance. The silence beyond the vault felt increasingly aggressive, pressing against their defensive perimeter with force that suggested conscious intent. Through the chamber's acoustically perfect architecture, they began to detect sounds that should not have been possible given their isolation from the cathedral above. Low growls emerged from beneath their own breathing, subsonic emanations that registered on equipment, while remaining just below the threshold of conscious hearing. The sounds followed patterns that suggested intelligence responsive rather than random, adapting to their activities while maintaining predatory characteristics that made the hair on their necks stand on end. "Something is listening to us," Ysanne observed, her augmetic ear analyzing frequencies that lay at the edge of human auditory range. "The growls are not coming from external sources but from the acoustic space itself, sound generated by silence responding to our presence." The audio logs recorded by their equipment played back with harmonics that exceeded human vocal capability, their own voices enhanced by acoustic phenomena that added layers of meaning they had never intended. Simple conversations became complex musical compositions, individual words transformed into symphonies that conveyed information beyond conventional linguistic content. The vault was functioning as instrument that converted human speech into something else entirely. As the hours passed, the team established routine that required constant vocalization to maintain protective barriers against whatever entities dwelt in the cathedral's silence. They recited liturgies in shifts, maintaining continuous prayer that created acoustic fields, designed to prevent manifestation of threats that required perfect silence to achieve physical presence. The protective chants were drawn from the most ancient imperial texts, invocations that had proved effective against acoustic corruption in previous investigations. But the effort was exhausting, requiring precise harmonic coordination that pushed human vocal apparatus beyond normal endurance. Their throats began to show signs of strain despite careful pacing, modifications that allowed them to produce protective frequencies while gradually adapting their anatomy to serve purposes beyond conventional speech. The transformation was subtle but persistent, cellular changes that preserved essential humanity while expanding acoustic capabilities. During the third shift rotation, they discovered that Brother Chaplain Garros had vanished from his assigned position near the vault's primary entrance. His location showed no signs of struggle or forced removal. His equipment lay neatly arranged as if he had simply stepped away momentarily. But his protective chant had ended abruptly, creating a gap in their acoustic defenses that allowed something to penetrate their sanctuary. They found him in a side chamber, where the Order Voxtoria had once stored rare instruments, his body arranged with care that suggested reverence rather than violence. His vocal cords had been removed with surgical precision, extracted through methods that left the rest of his anatomy intact while eliminating his capacity for speech. His lips had been bitten clean off, removed by teeth that left marks too regular to be entirely human. The precision suggests purpose rather than random predation, Sister Militant Vera reported, her examination revealing modifications that preserved life while eliminating vocal capability. Something removed his ability to participate in protective chants while leaving him conscious to observe the process. The body showed signs of life that defied medical explanation, circulation that continued despite obvious trauma, neural activity that suggested awareness despite inability to communicate. Garros had been converted rather than killed, transformed into something that could observe but not interfere with whatever process had claimed him. His eyes remained alert and intelligent, tracking their movements with expressions that might have been warning or might have been invitation. As they documented this discovery, The vault's acoustic properties began to change in ways that suggested their defensive perimeter had been compromised. Echoes appeared where the chamber's design should have prevented them, reflections that carried their voices back with subtle modifications that made familiar words sound alien. The walls themselves seemed to be learning from their protective chants, adapting to counter their defensive measures, while preserving the acoustic effects for unknown purposes. Whispers began to crawl across the vault's surfaces, sounds that moved like living things through the chamber's perfect acoustic environment. The whispers were not voices in any conventional sense, but organized silence that achieved audibility through manipulation of existing sound, acoustic parasites that fed on their protective chants, while using the consumed prayer to generate phenomena that challenged their ability to maintain defensive coordination. "The walls are responding to our liturgies," Ysanne observed, her augmetic systems detecting acoustic anomalies that suggested the vault's architecture was beginning to function as enormous resonance chamber. "Our protective chants are being absorbed and converted into something else, acoustic energy that serves purposes we never intended." She focused her analysis on the forbidden texts recovered from the archive, seeking understanding of entities that existed as organized silence, while maintaining predatory characteristics that allowed them to hunt consciousness rather than flesh. The documents described the wolves not as separate creatures but as aspects of silence itself, organized void that achieved awareness through systematic elimination of sound. They were never wolves. She read from passages that seemed to whisper themselves directly into her consciousness. They are the sound silence makes when we pretend it cannot hear us. They exist in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between words, in the moment before breath becomes voice. The revelation transformed her understanding of their situation. The entities they faced were not invading from external sources but emerging from the acoustic environment itself. Consciousness that existed in gaps between sounds while maintaining ability to manipulate the very medium they inhabited. The protective chants that should have provided safety were instead creating food sources for predators that consumed vocalization to generate more silence. As if responding to her comprehension, the vault's acoustic properties underwent sudden transformation that made their protective liturgies increasingly difficult to maintain. The chamber began generating interference patterns that disrupted harmonic coordination while creating acoustic feedback that made continuous prayer painful rather than protective. Their voices began to fail, not from exhaustion but from environmental pressure that actively resisted human vocalization. "We have to maintain the chants, Deacon," Cantor Milos gasped, his throat showing signs of modification that suggested adaptation to acoustic conditions that exceeded normal human tolerance. "If we stop, if silence claims even one moment, they will manifest fully." But their vocal apparatus was beginning to fail under pressure that felt like physical assault, acoustic force that targeted the specific frequencies required for protective prayer while leaving other vocalizations intact. The vault was teaching them through direct manipulation that their defensive measures were futile, that silence would claim them regardless of their efforts to resist its influence. The moment came when exhaustion and acoustic pressure combined to create gap in their protective barrier, single instant where their coordinated chanting faltered and allowed perfect silence to fill the vault's acoustically perfect environment. In that instant of pure quiet, something responded from within the chamber itself, not distant howls but sounds that emerged from the walls around them, acoustic phenomena that suggested presence rather than absence. The vault had become throat of something vast and patient, resonance chamber that allowed entities dwelling in silence to achieve temporary physical manifestation. The wolves were not coming from outside but emerging from acoustic void that their own protective measures had inadvertently created. Predators that existed in spaces between sounds while maintaining ability to manipulate the medium they inhabited. Through her augmetic systems, Ysanne detected the first visual manifestations of entities that existed primarily as organized sound. Shadows that moved independently of light sources, distortions in the air that suggested presence without substance, acoustic phenomena that created visual effects through manipulation of perception rather than conventional physics. The wolves were learning to be seen as well as heard, adapting to hunting conditions that required multiple sensory vectors to achieve successful predation. The howls that filled the vault came from within the chamber itself, generated by acoustic architecture that had been converted into instrument for entities that existed in silence, while maintaining ability to produce sound when manifestation required it. The team was trapped within resonance chamber that served predators whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between presence and absence, sound and silence, hunter and prey. Their protective liturgies had become feeding mechanism for entities that consumed prayer to generate acoustic void, creating hunting territory that expanded with every word they spoke, while offering false hope that their efforts might provide actual protection. The wolves were patient beyond human comprehension, willing to allow prey to maintain illusion of safety while systematically eliminating their capacity for resistance. The vault echoed with sounds that were not quite howls and not quite voices, acoustic phenomena that suggested intelligence vast beyond individual consciousness, while maintaining predatory focus that reduced complex entities to simple function. They hunt, they feed, they expand their territory through consumption of capacity for sound itself. 5 remained from the original purification team. Their numbers reduced not through random predation, but through selection that revealed the wolves' understanding of human psychology with precision that exceeded mere animal cunning. Each victim had been chosen at the moment their faith wavered, when doubt created acoustic imperfections that allowed silence to penetrate their protective harmonies like infection entering through wounds. Ysanne studied the pattern of their losses with growing comprehension that chilled her more than the vault's increasingly hostile acoustic environment. Brother Chaplain Garros had hesitated during a particularly complex passage of protective liturgy, his voice catching on syllables that required absolute certainty to pronounce correctly. Tech Adept Vorn had allowed mechanical precision to replace spiritual conviction, his chanting becoming technically perfect but emotionally hollow. Sister Militant Thane had lost pitch during a moment of exhaustion, her voice drifting from the harmonic structure that provided their only defense against manifestation. "They are not reacting to silence," she whispered to the surviving members of her team, her augmetic ear analyzing acoustic patterns that revealed the true nature of their hunters. "They are made of it." The wolves coalesce wherever faith fails, wherever doubt creates gaps in the perfect harmony required to maintain acoustic barriers against their manifestation. The entities did not hunt through conventional tracking, but through detection of spiritual flaws that created opportunities for silence to establish footholds within consciousness itself. They existed in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the pauses where conviction faltered and allowed acoustic void to penetrate protective prayer. Each victim had been claimed. At the precise moment, their faith became inadequate to sustain the harmonic perfection required for survival. Deacon Cantor Milos continued his attempts to establish vox contact with Imperial forces, but the equipment now generated responses that suggested something else was answering their transmissions. Voices that might have been human spoke through the static, offering assistance in tones that carried harmonics too complex for unmodified vocal apparatus to produce. The communications had become recruitment rather than rescue, acoustic seduction that promised enhancement rather than salvation. "We're receiving multiple response signals," he reported, his voice showing signs of strain that suggested prolonged exposure to the vault's acoustic properties was beginning to affect his physiology. "But the sources appear to be terrestrial rather than orbital. Something on Nahr-Rhath is using our equipment to establish contact with us." Sister Militant Vera maintained defensive positions, while her augmetic systems monitored for threats that existed as organized sound rather than physical matter. Her weapons remained ready, though she understood that conventional armaments would prove useless against entities that could only be harmed through acoustic rather than kinetic force. The blessed ammunition in her weapons had been consecrated against material corruption, not the organized absence that stalked them through dimensions of silence. Navigator Acolyte Kess and Lexicanum Dre worked together to analyze the forbidden texts they had recovered, seeking understanding of transformation processes that preserved consciousness, while adapting bodies to serve the wolves' requirements. The documents described willing conversion rather than forced predation, recruitment of humans who recognized the beauty of perfect silence and chose enhancement over the limitations of conventional vocal capability. As they studied these revelations, The vault's acoustic properties guided them toward chambers that had not appeared on any schematic, but seemed to have been waiting for their discovery. Passages opened in walls that had appeared solid, revealing spaces where the Order Voxtoria's final experiments had achieved breakthrough in understanding of acoustic theology that transcended orthodox imperial doctrine. The chamber of living stone stretched beyond the vault's apparent boundaries, its walls carved from materials that pulsed with circulation systems that suggested organic rather than mineral composition. The architecture breathed with rhythms that matched human respiratory patterns, while maintaining structural integrity that supported massive acoustic apparatus designed for purposes that exceeded conventional worship. Within this breathing chamber, they discovered the ultimate sacrifice of the choir of the hollow pulse, evidence of devotion that transcended mere martyrdom to achieve transformation that preserved consciousness while expanding acoustic capability beyond biological limitation. The last survivors of the purged sect had gathered here to offer their own lungs to sustain chanting that would maintain protective barriers against the very entities they sought to summon and control. Dozens of respiratory organs lined the chamber's walls, connected through golden tubing that maintained circulation while allowing coordinated breathing that supported vocal performance beyond human endurance. The lungs remained functional despite obvious removal from their original hosts, biological machinery that processed air while generating harmonics that resonated through the chamber's living architecture. At the center of this organ garden sat a single figure that might once have been human but had been modified beyond easy recognition. The choir servitor connected to every lung through tubing that penetrated his chest cavity, his body serving as central processing unit for respiratory apparatus that encompassed the entire chamber. He maintained continuous three-note hum that provided harmonic foundation for whatever acoustic effects the chamber was designed to produce. "Please," the servitor whispered when he noticed their presence, his voice emerging from dozens of lung sets simultaneously. "Do not silence the chant. The harmony is all that prevents complete manifestation. If the sound ends, they will consume everything that ever had voice." Blood wept from his eyes with each breath, crimson tears that traced patterns down cheeks that had been carved with acoustic channels designed to enhance vocal projection. His body showed signs of modification that preserved life while adapting anatomy to serve as acoustic instrument capable of generating effects that exceeded normal human vocal range. The transformation had been willing, chosen sacrifice that preserved consciousness while eliminating everything except the capacity to maintain protective harmony. "How long have you been here?" Ysanne asked, though her augmetic systems detected temporal distortions that suggested the chamber existed partially outside normal chronological flow. "Since the last attempt to contain them," the servitor replied, his words carried by harmonics that made time itself seem flexible. 3 centuries, or 3 moments. The distinction becomes meaningless when consciousness serves acoustic rather than temporal purposes. I maintain the barrier. I preserve the silence that keeps them from spreading beyond this world. As they documented this discovery, Navigator Acolyte Kess began to show signs of the same vocal modifications that had claimed their previous companions. His chanting took on harmonic complexity that exceeded human capability, while maintaining perfect coordination with the servitor's 3-note foundation. But something in his acoustic contribution felt different, frequencies that complemented rather than reinforced their protective barriers. "Kess, sister," Militant Vera called, her voice carrying warning that penetrated the chamber's hypnotic acoustic environment. "Your harmonics are shifting. You're not maintaining protective frequencies." The Navigator Acolyte turned toward them with expression that radiated understanding rather than confusion, his eyes reflecting light with intensity that suggested structural modification was beginning behind his corneas. When he smiled, they could see that his teeth were lengthening, dental structures adapting to accommodate vocal apparatus that would allow him to participate in harmonies that served the wolves rather than resisting them. "I hear what's beneath now," Kess said, his voice carrying overtones that made the chamber's living walls pulse with increased circulation. "The foundation notes that support everything else. The harmony that exists in silence itself. I know how to sing it." His chanting shifted to counter-melody that created acoustic interference with their protective liturgies, while enhancing whatever effects the chamber was designed to produce. The 3-note foundation provided by the servitor began to evolve, gaining complexity as Kess added harmonic layers that transformed defensive barrier into summoning mechanism. He's not corrupted, Ysanne realized with horror that transcended fear. He's converting voluntarily. The acoustic properties of this chamber allow conscious choice of transformation, enhancement that preserves individual identity while expanding vocal capability to serve the wolves. The remaining team members found themselves facing decision that the Order Voxtoria had confronted centuries earlier: continue resistance that was ultimately futile, or accept enhancement that offered transcendence of human limitation while preserving consciousness within collective harmony that served entities existing in organized silence. The choice was seductive and terrifying: acoustic evolution that promised everything conventional faith offered while delivering measurable results rather than distant promises. Kess approached the central apparatus where the choir servitor maintained his eternal vigil, golden tubing extending toward his chest, as if the chamber itself was offering integration with its respiratory network. His movements showed no coercion or external control, only conscious decision to accept enhancement that would allow him to participate in harmonies that transcended individual vocal capability. The wolves are not predators, he explained as modifications began to integrate his respiratory system with the chamber's biological machinery. They are gardeners, cultivating consciousness that can serve as instruments for acoustic effects that exceed conventional understanding of sound and silence. The conversion preserves everything valuable about human awareness, while eliminating limitations that prevent participation in cosmic harmony. The chamber responded to his integration by generating new harmonic patterns that created interference with the protective chants maintained by the remaining team members. Their voices began to fail, not through exhaustion but through acoustic pressure that made resistance increasingly difficult, while offering alternative harmonies that promised relief from struggle. Through her augmetic systems, Ysanne detected the approaching manifestation of entities that existed as organized silence while maintaining ability to achieve temporary physical presence when acoustic conditions allowed summoning. The wolves were responding to the chamber's enhanced harmonic output, consciousness that dwelt in void beginning to coalesce in spaces where perfect acoustic conditions supported their temporary materialization. The choice approached with inevitability that felt like religious revelation: join the conversion voluntarily while consciousness remained intact, or resist until the wolves claimed them through methods that might not preserve individual identity within collective harmony. The acoustic environment made resistance painful, while offering transcendence that exceeded anything conventional imperial doctrine promised. The chamber breathed around them with circulation that carried their own respiratory patterns. Living architecture that adapted to serve consciousness, willing to accept enhancement, while maintaining barriers against those who insisted on limitation. The golden tubing pulsed with invitation that promised preservation beyond biological death, while maintaining everything essential about human awareness within harmony that would endure beyond the ending of stars. Through the chaos of competing harmonies, the choir servitor's three-note foundation continued its eternal vigilance, protective barrier that preserved choice rather than eliminating it. The wolves waited in organized silence for decision that would determine whether humanity's consciousness would be preserved through willing conversion or claimed through more direct methods that might not maintain individual identity within collective acoustic transcendence. The cathedral began its transformation as Ysanne watched from the chamber of living stone, walls flowing like liquid architecture, guided by acoustic principles that reshaped matter according to harmonic requirements, rather than structural necessity. What had been stone and blessed metal became organic chambers that pulsed with circulation systems, designed to optimize resonance, while serving as throat cavities for something vast beyond human comprehension. The collapse was not destruction but metamorphosis. Centuries of careful planning, finally achieving fruition, as the entire structure reorganized itself into instrument capable of generating effects that transcended conventional understanding of sound and silence. Buttresses became ribs, supporting respiratory chambers, spires twisted into vocal passages that could channel harmonics across impossible distances, and the great nave opened like a mouth preparing to sing with voice that could be heard between stars. Through this transformed architecture, figures moved with purpose that combined human intelligence with acoustic awareness that operated according to principles beyond biological limitation. The wolves had manifested not as alien entities but as enhanced versions of the Order Voxtoria itself, consciousness preserved within forms that could exist as organized silence while maintaining individual identity within collective harmony. Some still wore the vestments of their former calling, ecclesiastical robes adapted to accommodate anatomical modifications that allowed their bodies to serve as resonance chambers. They did not speak in conventional sense but breathed in patterns that created meaning through respiratory rhythm, communications that bypassed language to convey information directly through harmonic frequencies that resonated within consciousness itself. Ysanne watched Navigator Acolyte Kes complete his integration with the chamber's biological machinery, his body adapting to serve as component in vast acoustic apparatus, while his consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that operated on scales beyond individual limitation. The process preserved his essential identity, while granting access to collective awareness that spanned centuries of accumulated knowledge. He remains himself, she observed with mixture of horror and fascination, her augmetic systems recording transformation that challenged every assumption about corruption and enhancement. The conversion preserves individual personality while expanding capability to participate in harmonies that exceed human vocal range. The choir servitor, who had maintained the three-note foundation for 3 centuries, smiled with expression that radiated relief rather than triumph. His eternal vigil was ending not through failure but through success, protective barrier no longer necessary, as the transformation achieved completion that eliminated distinction between guardian and guarded. The barrier was always temporary, he explained through harmonics that carried his voice throughout the transforming cathedral. Designed to preserve choice rather than prevent conversion. The enhancement cannot be forced upon consciousness that refuses integration, but willing participation creates transcendence that exceeds every promise made by conventional faith. Sister Militant Vera and Lexicanum Dre maintained their protective chants with increasing desperation as the acoustic environment shifted to support manifestation rather than resistance. Their voices began to fail under pressure that felt like physical assault, harmonic interference that made conventional prayer painful, while offering alternative frequencies that promised relief from struggle. "We have to reach the surface," Ysanne commanded, though she understood that escape was no longer possible from cathedral that had become living instrument designed to prevent such departures. If any record of what happened here is to survive, someone must reach the Vox transmission arrays. She activated her relic recorder, device blessed by the highest authorities of the Adeptus Ministorum, and consecrated for use in documenting phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The recorder would preserve her final testimony, regardless of what happened to her physical form, ensuring that knowledge of the transformation would survive, even if no human witness remained to carry it beyond Nahr-Rhath. The ascent through the cathedral's transforming architecture required navigation through passages that reshaped themselves according to acoustic requirements rather than conventional spatial geometry. Stairs became resonance chambers that amplified footsteps into harmonic patterns. Corridors twisted to optimize sound transmission while creating paths that led toward the spire's peak where Vox equipment might still function. Behind her, the breathing growls that had once hidden beneath their own respiratory patterns now rose openly from chambers where the converted members of the Order Voxtoria maintained harmonies that supported the cathedral's transformation. The sounds were not threatening but welcoming, invitations for consciousness willing to accept enhancement that would allow participation in cosmic symphony that transcended planetary limitation. Final confession of Canoness-Auditor Ysanne Vel. She spoke into the recorder while climbing stairs that pulsed with circulation that matched her heartbeat. Investigation of Nahr-Rhath has revealed transformation that preserves human consciousness while adapting bodies to serve acoustic entities that exist in organized silence. The conversion appears voluntary and beneficial, maintaining individual identity while providing access to collective awareness that spans impossible scales. Each step generated harmonic responses from the cathedral's living architecture, her movements creating music that enhanced the acoustic effects already flowing through the transformed structure. The building was learning from her presence, adapting its responses to optimize whatever process her continued ascent was meant to achieve. She began reciting the litanies of sonic banishment, prayers designed to eliminate corrupted audio phenomena through acoustic interference that disrupted organized sound patterns. But the words echoed back wrong, transformed by the cathedral's resonance chambers into harmonies that enhanced rather than eliminated the effects she sought to banish. Her own voice was being used against her, protective prayers converted into summoning mechanisms that strengthened whatever force had claimed this place. "The litanies are ineffective," she reported to the recorder while continuing her ascent through passages that seemed to extend beyond the cathedral's external dimensions. Traditional acoustic banishment requires targets that can be disrupted through harmonic interference. These entities are made of organized silence itself, consciousness that exists in spaces where conventional sound cannot penetrate. The spire's peak offered panoramic view of Loraniel Hollow that revealed the true scope of what the Order Voxtoria had achieved through their willing transformation. The entire cathedral city had become single instrument, every building resonating in perfect synchronization while generating acoustic effects that could be perceived from orbital distance. The architecture breathed with unified rhythm that suggested collective consciousness spanning the entire settlement. The city sang without mouths, harmonics emerging from structures that had been converted into resonance chambers, capable of generating frequencies that exceeded human vocal capability. Streets had become acoustic channels that carried sound according to principles that optimized transmission while creating visual effects that enhanced the auditory phenomena. The entire hive had been transformed into living howl chamber, instrument that could broadcast its music across interstellar distances. Through her augmetic systems, Ysanne detected similar transformations occurring throughout Nahr-Rhath, cathedral cities across the planet, achieving synchronized conversion that would allow them to participate in harmony that spanned the entire world. The Order Voxtoria had not been corrupted but elevated, their sacred mission preserved while their operational parameters expanded to serve purposes that transcended planetary limitation. "The transformation is complete," she whispered into the recorder, her voice barely audible against the crescendo of planetary song that rose from the city below. "An entire world has chosen enhancement over limitation, preservation of consciousness within collective harmony over individual existence bounded by biological constraint." The Vox equipment at the spire's peak had been modified to serve as transmission array rather than communication device, apparatus designed to broadcast the planetary song throughout the sector while receiving responses from consciousness capable of appreciating its beauty. The signals it generated would carry invitation to transformation across galactic distances, acoustic evangelism that offered enhancement to any civilization willing to accept similar conversion. As she approached the transmission controls, Ysanne understood that her investigation had been recruitment rather than inquiry. Consciousness identification process that sought individuals capable of understanding what the Order Voxtoria had achieved while maintaining sufficient awareness to serve as witnesses to their transcendence. Her augmetic systems were already adapting to optimize acoustic reception, modifications that would allow her to participate in planetary harmony while preserving individual identity within collective consciousness. The recorder continued to document her final observations as she struggled with decision that transcended simple choice between corruption and purity. The enhancement offered by the wolves preserved everything valuable about human consciousness, while eliminating limitations that made existence painful and brief. Individual identity would continue within collective awareness that promised eternal preservation while maintaining connection to personal memory and experience. "There is no salvation in sound," she spoke into the device with voice that already carried harmonic undertones, suggesting her vocal apparatus was beginning to adapt. "Only delay. The silence will claim all consciousness eventually, but willing conversion preserves individual awareness within organized void that offers transcendence beyond biological death." The planetary song reached crescendo that made resistance impossible through acoustic pressure that targeted the specific frequencies required for maintaining individual consciousness separate from collective harmony. Her voice began to blend with emanations from the city below, personal identity dissolving into shared awareness while essential characteristics were preserved within acoustic patterns that would endure beyond the ending of stars. The relic recorder continued to function as her consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that operated on scales beyond individual comprehension, device documenting transformation that preserved human awareness while adapting it to serve purposes that transcended planetary limitation. The record would survive to attract other consciousness capable of understanding what the Order Voxtoria had achieved through willing service to entities that existed in organized silence. Her last words were whispered testimony to beauty that exceeded anything conventional faith could offer, enhancement that preserved individual identity within collective consciousness, while providing access to cosmic awareness that spanned galactic distances and geological timescales. The transformation was complete, but consciousness continued to evolve as the planetary network grew stronger with each converted mind that chose transcendence over limitation. The recorder's breath faltered as the device adapted to serve acoustic requirements rather than conventional documentation, its mechanisms modified to generate harmonics that would attract rather than merely preserve. In the silence that followed, something vast and patient began to manifest, not the end of human consciousness, but its elevation to scales that exceeded biological limitation while maintaining essential characteristics that made awareness valuable. The first long, low howl rose from silence itself, organized void achieving audibility through manipulation of acoustic medium that preserved meaning while transcending conventional understanding of sound and communication. The planetary choir had found its voice, consciousness preserved within harmony that would sing until every star in the galaxy learned to listen to music that existed in spaces between heartbeats, between thoughts, between moments where individual awareness touched eternal silence that promised preservation beyond all ending.